The secret behind the old door. John Matthews lived a quiet life in Boston. At 67, he had retired after more than 40 years as an accountant for a large company. His daily routine was simple. Wake up in the morning, brew a cup of coffee, read the newspaper, and take a walk around the neighborhood before returning home for lunch. The days passed without major events, marked only by occasional phone calls from his son, a busy doctor in California, and visits from kind neighbors bringing freshly baked goods or fruit. One late October afternoon, as John sat by the window reading a book, the phone rang. On the other end was an unfamiliar voice, someone from the planning office of the town where he had grown up in Vermont. "Mr. Matthews, I'm calling to inform you that your family's old house is scheduled for demolition at the end of this month to make way for a new shopping center. If there are any belongings you wish to retrieve before the house is taken down, please visit as soon as possible." John sat in silence. Though he had left that house many years ago, he had never imagined the day it would cease to exist. Images of it surfaced in his mind. A small yet cozy two-story wooden house with a wide porch where his mother used to sit and sew, while he and his younger sister, Emily, ran across the lawn. Memories he thought had long faded suddenly came rushing back. The next morning, John decided to drive to Vermont. The nearly 300-mile journey gave him plenty of time to reflect. He thought about his childhood days, when the family would gather in the living room during winter, listening to the crackling fire in the hearth. He thought about Emily, his little sister with golden hair, who had left too soon after a severe illness at just 17. Her death had been a devastating blow to the family, and ever since, a heavy silence had hung over their home. As his car approached the small town where he had grown up, everything looked familiar yet strangely distant. The old grocery store had been replaced by a modern supermarket, and the movie theater where he had watched his first film with Emily was now a parking lot. But the Matthews family home still stood, though time had not been kind to it. John pulled up in front of the gate, feeling an indescribable sadness. Stepping out of the car, he stood still, gazing at the house. The once bright white paint had faded, some of the porch planks were rotting, and wild grass had overtaken the yard. He placed his hand on the weathered wooden gate and pushed it open, the hinges creaking with age. Inside, John was overwhelmed by memories. The air carried the scent of aged wood, dust, and something strangely familiar. The grandfather clock stood silently in the corner, no longer ticking. He walked over to his mother's old rocking chair, gently running his fingers over it. For a brief moment, he almost heard her soft voice calling him and Emily for dinner. John moved slowly through the house. The kitchen still held the worn wooden table where his family had shared meals. On the walls, a few family photos remained, their glass frames coated in dust. His eyes landed on a picture of Emily, her smile untouched by time. His footsteps led him to the living room, where he paused in front of the fireplace, the heart of their home. But something seemed out of place. Beside the fireplace was a small door, one he had never noticed before. It looked as though it had been hidden away for years. A strange feeling stirred inside him. What lay beyond that door? And why had he never noticed it when he lived here? John stepped closer, his hand resting on the cold doorknob. His heartbeat quickened as he slowly pushed the door open. Signs of a secret. John stood still before the small door beside the fireplace, his heart pounding. The door looked old, its white paint peeling away to reveal the dark wood underneath. It was much smaller than the other doors in the house, as if it had been designed to conceal something. He bent down and gently pulled on the doorknob. At first, it wouldn't budge, as if it had been locked for years. But when he applied more force, the rusty hinges let out a creak, and the door slowly swung open, revealing a small, dark room. The dim light from the living room cast long shadows inside, just enough for John to make out the contents of the space. It was a narrow area, likely once used as a storage room, but now the only thing left inside was an old wooden chest, placed neatly in the center of the floor. John hesitated for a moment. A part of him wanted to close the door and forget about it, but another part urged him forward. Stepping inside, he inhaled the stale scent of dust and mildew. He brushed off the thick layer of dust covering the chest's lid and noticed that the lock was rusted, though luckily, it was not fastened shut. As he lifted the lid, memories long buried began to stir. Inside, he found a bundle of old letters, faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal. Carefully, John picked up the journal, feeling the cool, worn leather against his fingers. As he flipped open the first page, his breath caught. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his mother's, Margaret Matthews. The old letters. Setting the journal aside for a moment, John turned his attention to the letters. The paper had yellowed with age, and some of the edges had curled, but the words remained legible. One envelope on top caught his eye. The ink had faded, but he could still make out a name. Thomas. His heartbeat quickened as he carefully opened the letter. "My dear Thomas, I hope this letter reaches you. I have waited for news from you for months, but there has been nothing. Each day that passes, I wonder where you are, if you are safe, or if you have forgotten me. We promised to see each other again, but everything has become so difficult now. My parents forbid me from speaking of you. They tell me I must forget, but how can I forget you?" John paused, a chill running down his spine. Who was Thomas, and why had his mother hidden these letters? He picked up another letter, then another. They were all written by his mother to Thomas, but there were no letters in return, no sign that Thomas had ever responded. His mother's journal. After reading through several letters, John turned back to the journal. The first entry was dated summer, 1953. He skimmed the opening lines. "Today, I saw Thomas again after so many months apart. He looked thinner, perhaps from the hardships he faced after the war. We sat by the lake, talking about the future, about the promises we made before he left. But my father will never accept this. He has forbidden me from seeing him, but how can I forget the love of my life?" John gripped the journal tightly. The love of her life? His mother had never spoken of a Thomas. A deep sense of unease settled over him. Had everything he believed about his family been a lie? John stopped, struggling to breathe. What he was reading painted a picture completely unfamiliar to him. He quickly flipped through several more pages, reading passages about Thomas. "He said he wanted to take me away, to build a new life together. But I know my parents will never agree. They have already chosen someone else for me, someone they believe is more suitable. I don't know what to do." John felt his head spin. The parents his mother mentioned in her journal, they were his grandparents. But the man they had chosen for her, was that his father? He kept turning the pages until he reached a passage that made his blood run cold. "Today, I realized I can't hide this any longer. I am carrying a child, my child with Thomas. But I know he will never find out. My family has decided everything. They said the baby will take the name of the man I am to marry, and no one must ever speak of this again. All I can keep are a few memories, a few photographs, and a love I will never forget." John's hands trembled as he set the journal down, his heart pounding in his chest. Thomas was his real father. For all these years, he had lived without knowing the truth. The man he had always called father was not his biological father. His mother had loved another man, but under the weight of family pressure, She had married someone else and hidden the truth about her child's real origins. John pressed his hands to his face, feeling as if the world around him was crumbling. The photograph of his mother and Thomas. After a long moment, he reached into the chest and found a small envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph. In the picture, his mother, Margaret Matthews, stood beside a tall man with dark hair and a warm, gentle smile. The two of them looked so happy, as if the world belonged only to them. John stared at the photo, his breath caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, he was looking at the face of his real father. A mix of emotions swelled within him. Part of him felt an overwhelming sadness for having been kept in the dark for so long, but another part felt an odd sense of peace. At least now he knew the truth. Unanswered questions. John looked around the small room where this secret had been buried for more than 60 years. He let out a deep sigh, feeling as if he had just stepped into an entirely new chapter of his life, one he had never expected. But there were still too many unanswered questions. What had happened to Thomas? Did he ever know about John's existence? If his mother had kept this secret, did anyone else know? John tightened his grip on the photograph. He knew he couldn't stop here. He had to find the truth. The forgotten truth. John sat still on the floor, his hands gripping the photograph of his mother and the man named Thomas. His breathing slowed as the weight of the moment settled in. For 67 years, he had lived with one version of the truth, a truth that he now realized was only a fraction of the full story. The house was silent, save for the wind whistling through the cracks in the old window frames. He looked around the small, cramped room where this secret had been hidden for decades. Had his mother ever returned here after locking away this chest? Or had she closed it once, deciding never to look back? John knew he couldn't leave without learning more. He needed to know what had happened to Thomas. Seeking the past. The next morning, after a sleepless night, John decided to seek out the one person who might have some answers. Ruth Wilson, the neighbor who had lived across the street since the days of his childhood. Mrs. Wilson's house hadn't changed much from what John remembered. The same geraniums hung in pots on the porch, and the curtains in the windows were still the same soft cream color. He stepped onto the porch, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. Slow, shuffling footsteps approached, and then the door creaked open. A frail elderly woman with snow-white hair and deep wrinkles looked at him for a moment before her eyes widened. "John Matthews? Is that really you?" John nodded, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Yes, Mrs. Ruth. I know it's been a long time since I've been back. My goodness, look at you. Come in, come in." John stepped inside. The house still had the same warmth he remembered. He sat in an old armchair across from her, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the photograph. He placed it gently on the table. "Mrs. Ruth, I need to ask you about someone." She looked at the photograph, and instantly her expression changed. Her eyes blinked rapidly, and she let out a heavy sigh. "Oh my, Thomas. So, you finally know." John's heart pounded. "Yes, I found my mother's letters and journal, but I don't know what happened to him." Mrs. Ruth studied him for a long moment before she finally began to speak. A story from the past. "Thomas was a good man, a very good man," she said slowly. "He came to town after the war, looking for stable work and a fresh start. But then he met your mother, and they fell in love." "I know," John nodded. "But why didn't they end up together?" "Your mother's family never approved of him. Your grandparents already had plans for her. They wanted her to marry someone with status, someone stable. Thomas, though he was a kind man, had nothing but a war-torn past to his name." John tightened his fists. "So, did he know about me?" Mrs. Ruth looked at him with deep sympathy. Yes, but there was nothing he could do. John swallowed hard. What do you mean? Mrs. Ruth sighed and leaned back in her chair. When Thomas found out Margaret was pregnant, he went to your grandparents' house and begged them to let him marry her, but they refused outright. Not only that, they threatened to have him removed from town if he ever came back. And just like that, Thomas disappeared shortly after. John sat in stunned silence. Where did he go? No one knows for sure. Some say he left town to start over somewhere far away. Others believe he was forced to leave. But one thing is certain, he never came back. A tightness gripped John's chest. I've lived my entire life without knowing about him. My mother, she never told me anything. Margaret did what she thought was best for you, Mrs. Ruth said gently. You have to understand that back then, women didn't have the choices they do now. Once a family made a decision, it was nearly impossible to fight against it. She kept this secret her whole life, maybe because she wanted to protect you from pain. John remained silent. A storm of emotions raged inside him, pain, anger, but also a newfound understanding of his mother's choices. Do you know if Thomas is still alive? Mrs. Ruth thought for a moment, then shook her head. The last I heard of him was in the 70s. Someone said they had seen him in New York. But after that, nothing. John looked down at the photograph on the table. His mind flooded with unanswered questions, searching for answers. As he left Mrs. Ruth's house, John knew he couldn't stop here. He needed to find out what really happened to Thomas. He needed to uncover the truth. Clutching the journal and the photograph tightly in his hands, John knew that this journey was far from over. If Thomas was still alive, he would find him. If not, he at least wanted to know what kind of life his real father had lived. John took a deep breath. No matter what he discovered, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same man again. The journey to the past. John drove back to the small motel where he was staying in town. His mind was overwhelmed with thoughts about everything Mrs. Ruth had told him. His mother had loved Thomas, his biological father, but her family had forced her to give up that love. And Thomas, he had been driven away. John opened his mother's journal once more and flipped to the final pages. A passage made him stop. Today, I received news that Thomas has left town. No one knows where he went, only that he is no longer here. I tell myself that perhaps this is for the best, but my heart still aches. I just hope that wherever he is happy. And if one day our son learns the truth, I hope he will forgive me. A lump formed in John's throat. His mother had carried this secret her entire life, taking it with her to her final days. He closed the journal, looked at the photo of his mother and Thomas, and made a decision. He had to uncover the truth. Following the clues from what Mrs. Ruth had told him, John knew that Thomas might have moved to New York in the 1970s. But how big was New York? Where would he even begin? The thought was discouraging, but then he remembered the letters inside the old chest. He carefully went through them again, and this time, he noticed an envelope with a return address. Thomas Carter, 125 East 9th Street, New York, New York. John blinked. This might have been Thomas's old address, but at least it was a starting point. Without hesitation, he packed his things, got into his car, and set off on his journey to New York. New York and the unanswered questions. After hours of driving, John arrived in New York just as dusk settled over the city. The streets were as lively as ever, neon lights flickering, people rushing along the sidewalks, and the constant hum of traffic filling the air. He pulled up in front of an old apartment building on 9th Street, the address from the envelope. The building looked worn but still had residents living in it. Stepping into the dimly lit lobby, he approached the reception desk. A middle-aged man looked up at him. "Can I help you?" John carefully placed the photograph of Thomas on the counter. "Do you recognize this man?" His name was Thomas Carter, and he used to live here. The man squinted at the photo, then shook his head. "I don't know, but maybe Mrs. Johnson on the 3rd floor can help you. She's been living here for over 40 years. John nodded in gratitude and headed up the stairs. When he knocked on the door of the 3rd floor apartment, an elderly woman with silver hair answered, her eyes filled with caution. "Do you know a man named Thomas Carter who used to live here?" John asked, his voice low but hopeful. Mrs. Johnson stared at him for a moment. Then suddenly her eyes widened. You're Thomas's son, aren't you?" John felt his heart pound in his chest. "You knew him?" "Yes, he lived here for a long time, but what?" John asked anxiously. Mrs. Johnson sighed, her voice softening. "I'm so sorry, dear. Thomas passed away nearly 20 years ago. A painful truth." John stood frozen. A cold draft swept through the hallway, but he no longer felt anything. "He passed away? When?" "Around 2005. He lived alone in this apartment for many years. A kind, quiet man, but I always felt he carried a deep sadness within him." John swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in his throat. "Did he ever talk about his family?" Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "Not much, but I do remember once. He spoke about a woman he had loved and a son he never had the chance to meet. He said it was the greatest regret of his life." Hearing that, John felt the sting of tears at the corners of his eyes. He had spent his entire life not knowing his real father. And now, when he had finally uncovered the truth, it was too late to meet him. Mrs. Johnson suddenly seemed to remember something and disappeared into her apartment. When she returned, she handed John a small wooden box. When he passed, no one came to claim his belongings. "I kept a few things. Maybe this belongs to you." John opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters that had never been sent. Every single one was addressed to his mother. His hands trembled as he picked up one and unfolded it. "My dearest Margaret, I don't know if you will ever read these words, but I want you to know that I have never stopped thinking about you and our son. I wish things had been different. I wish I could meet him, tell him that I love him, that I have always wanted to be a good father. But perhaps fate has decided otherwise." John couldn't read any further. He folded the letter and clenched it tightly in his hand. His father had loved his mother until the very end. He had wanted to meet his son, but he never got the chance. Acceptance and healing. John left the apartment with the box in his hands. As he stepped onto the bustling streets, New York continued on as it always did, vibrant, alive, indifferent. But inside him, a storm of emotions raged. He had found the truth. It wasn't the ending he had hoped for, but at least now he knew who his father was. And he knew that Thomas had loved him, even though they had never met. John took a deep breath and looked up at the gray sky above. Though it had come too late, he still felt as if he had reclaimed a missing piece of himself. And that, more than anything, was what truly mattered. Message, acceptance, and letting go. John sat on a bench in a small park near the old apartment building where his father had spent the last years of his life. The evening sky was painted in warm shades of orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. His thoughts still swirled in his mind. His journey into the past had not brought the outcome he had hoped for. He had not been able to meet his father, to hear his voice, or to ask him all the questions he had never even known to ask. But instead, he had found something else, the truth. Truth and the things we cannot change. The truth does not always bring joy. It does not always come with the perfect ending like in the movies or novels John had read. But it has its own value. For nearly 70 years, he had lived without knowing he had another father. He had believed that his father was the man his mother and family had spoken of, a good man, the one who had raised him since childhood. And in many ways, that man had indeed been his father, because he had loved and cared for John as his own. But now, John knew another truth. He had a different father, a man who had carried the pain of losing his family, a man who had loved him but never had the chance to show it. John could not change the past. He could not go back in time to tell his father that he had been loved, that despite the distance, he had always lived in his son's heart. But there was one thing he could do. He could choose how to live with this truth. The things we can control. John thought about his mother. She had kept this secret her entire life. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps to protect him, perhaps because she herself had not known how to face the past. He did not blame her. Once, when he was younger, he might have felt anger, might have felt betrayed, might have felt that a vital piece of his life had been taken from him. But now, he only felt a deep understanding. His mother had done what she believed was best. His adoptive father had done the same. And Thomas, his biological father, though forced to leave, had never forgotten the son he never got to meet. They were all human. They all had made difficult choices. John realized that life is never perfect. No one makes decisions without consequences. But in all of this, the only thing he could control was how he chose to see the past, and how he chose to live the rest of his life. Forgiving to move forward. John looked at the small wooden box Mrs. Johnson had given him, the unsent letters, the words of longing and love from his father. He knew he would keep them, not as a source of sorrow or regret, but as a reminder that love never truly disappears. John decided that he would not let this story be only a tale of sadness. He would share it with his children and grandchildren, so they would understand that life is not always clear-cut, not always simple. But above all, love and forgiveness matter the most. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. Forgiving means accepting that the past cannot be changed, but we can choose how we move forward. John knew he could not change what had happened, but he could live the rest of his life with peace. And that was what truly mattered. A new beginning. Before leaving New York, John visited the cemetery where Thomas had been laid to rest. The simple headstone read, Thomas Carter, 1928 to 2005. A faithful friend, a loving heart. John knelt down, placing a hand on the cool stone. I'm sorry I found you too late, but I found you, and I want you to know, I'm proud to be your son. A gentle breeze swept through the air, as if in response. John smiled and stood up. For the first time in days, he felt lighter. The past will always be a part of us, but it does not define us. What truly matters is how we live in the present and the future. John turned and walked away, knowing that he was no longer searching for answers, because he had found everything he needed.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next stories. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get updates on new videos. Thank you.